Some families bury the truth right alongside the person they lost. Mine tried to. My name is Margaret. I was 58 years old when my husband, Robert, passed away after a long illness. And on the day of his funeral, the day I should have been allowed to simply grieve, my own stepson pulled me aside, gripped my arm a little too tightly, and said 7 words I will never forget. "Don't embarrass us at the funeral." He said it like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. Like I hadn't spent 15 years of my life loving his father, caring for him, sitting beside his hospital bed night after night while his own children rarely visited. He said it like I was a problem to be managed. What he didn't know was that folded neatly inside my black handbag, tucked beside a tissue and an old photograph of Robert and me on our wedding day, was a document that was about to change everything. His father's real will. Not the one David believed existed. Not the one he and his sister had already, quietly, begun planning around. The real one. And in less than 2 hours, in front of everyone gathered to say goodbye to Robert, that document was going to reveal exactly what kind of man his son had become, and exactly how far he was willing to go for money. But to understand how we got to that moment, I need to take you back. Back to the beginning of my marriage to Robert, and the slow, quiet war his children waged against me for over a decade. I met Robert when I was 43 years old, working as a hospital administrator, recently divorced, not looking for anything serious. He was a widower, raising 2 teenagers alone after losing his first wife, Carol, to cancer 3 years earlier. We met in the most unremarkable way, waiting in line at a coffee shop near the hospital where I worked. He made a joke about the terrible coffee. I laughed harder than the joke deserved. That was it. That was the beginning. Robert was gentle, patient, and endlessly kind. He had built a modest but successful hardware business over 20 years, the kind of steady, honest work that doesn't make headlines but builds a comfortable, secure life. When we married 2 years later, his children were 16 and 14. David, the older one, was polite but distant from the start. His younger sister, Claire, warmed to me slowly, cautiously, the way children do when they're afraid of betraying a parent they lost. I never tried to replace Carol. I told them that on our very first dinner together as a family. "I'm not here to take your mother's place," I said. "I'm just here because I love your father, and I hope, in time, there might be room for me too." Claire eventually let me in. David never fully did. For years, things were peaceful enough on the surface. Holidays were shared. Birthdays were celebrated. David grew into an ambitious young man, eventually running a small marketing consultancy that struggled more than he ever admitted publicly. Claire moved 2 states away, building a quiet, steady life as a schoolteacher. But underneath that surface, small cracks had always existed. David rarely called just to talk. He called when he needed something alone, just until the next contract came through. Help covering a business expense, a favor with one of Robert's longtime clients. Robert, being the generous man he was, rarely said no. I watched this pattern repeat for years, watched Robert quietly transfer money to David more times than I could count, always followed by the same promise. "I'll pay you back soon, Dad, I swear." He never did. I never said much about it. It wasn't my place, I told myself. Robert was a grown man who could make his own decisions about his own son. But 3 years before Robert passed away, something happened that I couldn't stay silent about. Robert was diagnosed with a slow-progressing heart condition. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic at first, but serious enough that his doctors recommended he begin organizing his affairs, just to be safe. That's when David's visits suddenly became more frequent. Not out of concern for his father's health, though he always framed it that way. Out of concern, I began to suspect, for his father's assets. David began asking pointed questions during his visits. Questions about the business. Questions about the house. Questions about whether Robert had updated anything legally recently. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Grief does strange things to families, I reminded myself. Maybe David was simply scared of losing his father and processing it the only way he knew how, through logistics and control. But then, 6 months before Robert passed, I found something that changed my perspective completely. I was helping Robert organize paperwork in his home office, something we did together most weekends by then, as his energy grew more limited. Buried in a folder I didn't recognize, I found a document. A power of attorney form, partially filled out, in David's handwriting, not Robert's. It hadn't been signed, it hadn't been notarized, it wasn't legal yet. But it was clearly prepared carefully, deliberately granting David significant control over Robert's financial decisions, in the event of incapacity. I showed it to Robert immediately. His face went pale as he read it. "I never asked for this," he said quietly. "I never agreed to this." We later learned, through a careful conversation with our family lawyer, that David had approached him separately, months earlier, requesting information, just in case something happens to Dad, framing it as responsible planning. The lawyer, thankfully, had refused to proceed without Robert's direct, explicit involvement, standard practice, done properly. But it was clear David had been laying groundwork, quietly, patiently, preparing for a future where he controlled his father's assets before his father had even passed. Robert was devastated, not angry, exactly, just deeply, quietly hurt. "I raised him better than this," he said to me that night, sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at nothing in particular. "Didn't I?" I didn't have an answer for him. Some wounds, I've learned, don't have answers. They only have consequences. After discovering that unsigned document, something shifted in Robert. He didn't confront David directly, that wasn't his way. Robert avoided conflict his entire life, always hoping time and patience would heal what harsh words couldn't. Instead, he made a quieter decision, a private one. He scheduled a meeting with our family lawyer, a careful, thorough woman named Patricia who had handled Robert's business affairs for over a decade. Just the two of them at first. Then, a few weeks later, he asked me to join. "I want to update my will," he told Patricia, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was saying. "Properly, completely, and I want to make sure it can't be questioned or manipulated later." Over the following months, Robert restructured his estate carefully and legally, leaving nothing to chance. The bulk of the family business, the one he had built from nothing over 2 decades, would be placed into a structured trust, managed initially by Patricia's firm, with clear provisions ensuring it couldn't be liquidated or borrowed against without formal, verified approval. The family home would come to me, fully and unconditionally, in recognition of the 15 years I had spent building a life and a home alongside him. A meaningful portion of savings would be split between David and Claire Generous, but structured with conditions. Funds released gradually over several years, rather than as one lump sum, specifically designed to prevent impulsive spending or exploitation. And a smaller, separate provision was created for Robert's 2 grandchildren, Claire's children, held in an education trust, untouchable by anyone except for direct tuition and schooling expenses. Robert was thorough. He wasn't trying to punish David. He told me that many times. "I still love him," he said. "He's still my son, but loving someone doesn't mean handing them the keys to destroy themselves or us." Here's what made this story so painful, and honestly, so common in families dealing with aging parents and inheritance. David never knew this newell existed. He believed, based on an older version drafted nearly 8 years earlier before his troubling financial patterns had fully revealed themselves, that he would inherit direct, unrestricted control over roughly half of his father's estate, including significant authority over the family business itself. Robert, in his quiet way, chose not to tell David about the update. "Why give him time to prepare a fight?" Robert reasoned, "when I can simply protect what matters and let the truth speak for itself when the time comes." I wasn't entirely comfortable with the secrecy. I told Robert honestly, more than once, that I worried David would feel blindsided, that the shock alone might cause even more damage to their relationship. But Robert was firm. David already knows what he tried to do, he said. He doesn't get to also control how and when the truth comes out. Looking back now, I understand what Robert meant. Because in the end, David's reaction to being blindsided revealed far more about his character than any confrontation ever could have. Robert's health declined steadily over the following 2 years. Through it all, I stayed by his side: hospital visits, medication schedules, difficult nights where fear outweighed hope. David visited occasionally during this time, always polite on the surface, always asking, in careful, roundabout ways, about how things were being handled financially. Claire visited more often, and more genuinely, sitting with her father for hours, reading to him, asking nothing of him except his presence. The difference between his 2 children, during those final years, became impossible to ignore. Robert noticed it too. He never said so directly, but I saw it in the quiet, grateful way he looked at Claire during her visits, and the careful, guarded way he spoke to David during his. 6 weeks before Robert passed, during one of his more difficult nights, he took my hand and said something I've carried with me ever since. "Margaret, when I'm gone, there's going to be a moment, probably at the funeral, probably in front of everyone, where the truth is finally going to come out. I need you to be strong enough to let it happen. Don't shrink from it. Don't apologize for it. Just let the truth do what truth always eventually does." I promised him I would. I didn't fully understand, at the time, just how soon that promise would be tested. Robert passed away peacefully on a quiet Tuesday morning, with Claire and me both by his side. David arrived 4 hours later, having been in a business meeting when the call came. The funeral was scheduled for the following week, a modest, dignified service at the same church where Robert and I had married 15 years earlier. In the days leading up to it, David's behavior grew increasingly controlling. He inserted himself into every planning decision, insisted on approving the guest list, questioned every expense related to the service, and most tellingly began speaking to family, friends, and business associates in ways that made it clear he saw himself as the primary heir, the one now stepping into his father's role. I said nothing. I let him have his moment of perceived control. I understood, in a strange way, that grief made some people cling tightly to whatever certainty they could find, even if that certainty was built on a version of the future that no longer existed. But 3 days before the funeral, David crossed a line that even my patience couldn't quietly absorb. David called me on a Wednesday evening, his voice clipped, businesslike, the way he spoke during moments he considered practical necessities. "Margaret, I think we need to talk about the funeral arrangements and afterward." Afterward meaning the estate. He didn't even try to soften it. "I've spoken to a lawyer friend of mine," he continued, "just to understand the general process. I assume Dad's will is fairly straightforward, given how things were structured years ago. I want to make sure the transition of the business happens smoothly, without unnecessary complications." I chose my words carefully. "David, I think it's best if we wait until after the funeral to discuss any of that. This isn't the right time." There was a pause, then his tone shifted, sharper now. "Margaret, I appreciate everything you did for my dad these past years, I really do. But I need you to understand something. This family and this business existed long before you married into it. I need to make sure things are handled properly, by family, not complicated by outside sentiment." Outside sentiment. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of caring for his father through illness, through every hospital visit, through countless sleepless nights. Reduced, in his mind, to outside sentiment. I stayed calm. "I understand you're grieving, David. We all are. Let's focus on honoring your father right now." "Just don't embarrass us at the funeral," he said suddenly, his voice tightening. "Don't make a scene, don't bring up anything about money or business in front of guests. This is a dignified event, and I need it to stay that way." I felt something harden inside me in that moment, not anger exactly, but a quiet, unshakable resolve. "I have no intention of embarrassing anyone, David," I said evenly. "I only intend to honor your father's true wishes." He didn't catch the weight behind those words. He simply said, "Good, I'm glad we understand each other," and ended the call. He had no idea how right he was, just not in the way he assumed. The night before the funeral, I sat alone in Robert's home office, the same room where we had discovered that unsigned power of attorney document years earlier. I opened the folder containing his finalized will, the one Patricia had prepared, reviewed, and formally executed nearly 2 years before his passing. I read it slowly, one more time, remembering his voice as he'd explained each provision to me. I thought about David's words, "Don't embarrass us," outside sentiment, family not complicated by outside sentiment. I thought about all the years I had quietly absorbed his coldness, his suspicion, his barely concealed resentment, all in the name of keeping peace within Robert's family, for Robert's sake. Robert was gone now, but his voice echoed clearly in my memory. Don't shrink from it. Don't apologize for it. Just let the truth do what truth always eventually does. I called Patricia that evening. "I think it's time," I told her. "At the funeral, if David tries to make any kind of announcement or claim about the estate in front of guests, which, knowing him, I suspect he might, I want you present, prepared, with the documentation ready." Patricia, who had known Robert for over a decade and understood exactly what kind of quiet, careful man he had been, agreed without hesitation. "Robert always said the truth would find its moment," she said gently. "Sounds like that moment is tomorrow." I barely slept that night. Not out of nervousness about David, but out of grief, pure, simple grief for the man I had loved for 15 years, the man who had shown me, every single day, what quiet devotion truly looked like. I thought about our wedding day, the photograph tucked into my handbag. I thought about the countless ordinary evenings we'd spent together, doing nothing more remarkable than sharing dinner and comfortable silence. I thought about his hand in mine during his final days, weak but still warm, still present. Whatever happened tomorrow, I told myself, it wouldn't change what Robert and I had built together. No document, no confrontation, no amount of David's anger could erase 15 years of genuine love. But I also understood something else, something Robert had clearly understood long before his passing. Sometimes, honoring someone's memory means refusing to let their final wishes be buried alongside them. Tomorrow, I would keep my promise to Robert, whatever it cost. The morning of the funeral was quiet and gray, a soft rain falling just enough to blur the edges of everything. I arrived early, as I always did for important things, wearing a simple black dress, Robert's photograph and Patricia's phone number both tucked safely into my handbag, alongside the folder containing his final will. David arrived shortly after, dressed impeccably, greeting guests with practiced, solemn handshakes, the picture of a grieving son taking charge of his father's affairs with dignity. Claire arrived next, her eyes already red from crying, her 2 children beside her, subdued and confused by the heaviness surrounding them. Guests filled the small church, steadily old business partners of Robert's, longtime neighbors, friends from every stage of his life. I recognized many of them. Robert had touched more lives than even he had realized. The service itself was beautiful in the quiet, understated way Robert would have wanted. The pastor spoke warmly of his kindness, his integrity, his quiet generosity toward everyone he met. Several guests shared brief, heartfelt memories. I sat in the front row, beside Claire and her children, David sitting slightly apart from us, near the aisle, greeting mourners as they passed, almost as if he were hosting the event rather than grieving within it. Throughout the service, I felt calm, steady, present with my grief rather than anxious about what was coming after. I trusted Robert's plan. I trusted the truth. After the service, guests gathered at the reception hall adjoining the church for a modest gathering, light refreshments, quiet conversation, the gentle, familiar rhythm of a community coming together to comfort a grieving family. I was speaking with one of Robert's oldest business partners, sharing a memory about the early days of the hardware store, when I noticed David moving toward the small raised platform at the front of the room, where a microphone had been set up earlier for the pastor's opening remarks. He tapped the microphone gently, clearing his throat. "If everyone could give me just a moment," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. "I know this isn't the traditional time for this, but given how many of you knew my father through his business, I wanted to take a moment to speak about the future, about how the family plans to honor his legacy moving forward." My stomach tightened. He continued, his tone confident, almost rehearsed. "As many of you know, my father built Weller Hardware from nothing, over 20 years of hard work and dedication. As his eldest child, I intend to step into a leadership role at the company, ensuring that his vision and his legacy continue exactly as he would have wanted." Murmurs of polite, uncertain acknowledgement moved through the room. Several guests exchanged glances, unsure whether this was appropriate funeral etiquette or simply David's way of processing grief through control. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "I also want to reassure everyone here today that the family's affairs are being handled properly, and that I'll personally be overseeing the transition of assets to ensure continuity and stability during this difficult time." He was, in front of 200 grieving guests, publicly positioning himself as the sole authority over his father's estate before the will had even been formally read. I felt Claire's hand tighten around mine. "Is he seriously doing this right now?" she whispered, disbelief and embarrassment coloring her voice. I took a slow, steadying breath. Robert's voice echoed in my memory one final time. "Don't shrink from it." I stood up. The room quieted slightly as I made my way toward the front, my handbag held steadily in my hands. David's confident expression faltered slightly as he watched me approach the platform, clearly not expecting this. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge beneath the polite surface, "I think we can discuss any additional details privately, don't you?" "I agree completely, David," I said calmly, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "Which is why I'm a little confused why you've chosen to discuss estate matters publicly, at your father's funeral, before anyone has even reviewed his actual final wishes." A ripple of uncomfortable silence moved through the room. David's jaw tightened. "Margaret, this isn't the time." "You're right," I interrupted gently but firmly. "It isn't, which is exactly my point." I turned slightly toward the gathered guests, many of whom were now watching with a mixture of confusion and quiet curiosity. "I apologize for this interruption," I said, my voice softening with genuine grief. "This isn't how I wanted to spend today either. Today should be about honoring Robert, his kindness, his integrity, the beautiful life he built. But since my stepson has chosen to discuss his father's legacy and estate publicly, I think it's only fair that everyone understands the full truth, rather than an assumption." I reached into my handbag and withdrew the folder. "Robert updated his will nearly 2 years ago," I said clearly. "Properly, legally, with full documentation through our family attorney, Patricia Chen, who is here today and can confirm everything I'm about to say." David's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence completely drained. "Margaret, don't do this," he said quietly, urgently, the warning in his voice unmistakable now. "Not here." "I'm not doing anything, David," I said gently. "I'm simply refusing to let your father's true wishes be buried under an assumption you built for yourself." Patricia rose from her seat near the back of the room, calm and composed, carrying her own copy of the formally executed documentation. "I can confirm everything Margaret is saying," she said, her voice professional and clear. "Robert Weller updated his will nearly 2 years ago, through my firm, with full legal documentation, witnessed and notarized appropriately. I'm happy to discuss the details privately with immediate family whenever appropriate, but given that Mr. Weller has chosen to make public statements about the estate today, I believe transparency is now warranted." The room had gone completely silent, save for the soft rustle of uncomfortable shifting. David stood frozen at the platform, his earlier composure completely shattered. I continued, my voice steady. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here to honor Robert's actual wishes, which he was very clear and deliberate about." I glanced briefly at David, allowing a moment of genuine compassion into my voice, despite everything. David, your father loved you. He never stopped loving you, not for one single day. But he also knew, in his final years, that love sometimes means protecting what matters most, even from the people you love. I turned back toward the gathered guests. Robert restructured the family business into a protected trust, specifically to prevent it from being liquidated, borrowed against, or controlled by any single individual without proper oversight. He did this after discovering an unsigned power of attorney document that had been prepared, without his knowledge or consent, attempting to grant unrestricted control over his assets. Gasps moved through the room now, quiet but unmistakable. David's face had gone from pale to flushed with humiliation and anger. "This is completely inappropriate," he said, his voice shaking. "You're trying to destroy my reputation in front of everyone who matters to this family's business relationships." "No, David," I said gently but firmly. "You did that yourself, months before your father even passed away. I'm simply refusing to let his true wishes remain hidden any longer." I want to pause the story here, because I think it's important to explain something clearly. I didn't stand up that day to punish David. I didn't relish exposing him in front of 200 guests. If David hadn't chosen, of his own free will, to publicly position himself as the sole heir before the will had even been formally read, if he hadn't tried to control the narrative in front of Robert's entire community, I would have waited. I would have handled everything privately, exactly as Patricia and I had originally planned. But David created that moment himself. Every word he spoke on that platform was his own choice, born from years of quiet entitlement, finally reaching its breaking point. I simply refused to let his false narrative stand unchallenged. Claire approached the platform then, gently placing her hand on my shoulder, her voice trembling but clear as she addressed the room. "I want everyone to know," she said, "that I fully support whatever arrangements our father made. He was a thoughtful, careful man who thought deeply about protecting this family, even from within. Whatever he decided, I trust it completely." David looked between his sister and me, something shifting in his expression, the realization, perhaps for the first time, that he stood alone in that room, his own actions having isolated him from the people who might have otherwise supported him. Patricia stepped forward, addressing the room with calm professionalism. "I think it's best we conclude the formal aspects of today's gathering and allow the family to discuss the remaining details privately, as originally planned. I'll be available to answer any procedural questions immediately following." The reception slowly resumed its quieter rhythm, guests offering careful, sympathetic glances toward our family as they returned to soft conversation, clearly sensing they had witnessed something deeply personal unfold. David left the reception hall shortly after, his face still flushed, refusing to meet anyone's eyes as he walked out. I didn't chase after him. I didn't feel triumphant. I simply felt exhausted, the particular exhaustion that comes from finally releasing a weight you've carried silently for far too long. Claire squeezed my hand. "Dad would be proud of you," she whispered. I wasn't sure about proud, but I knew, without doubt, that I had finally kept my promise. 3 days after the funeral, our family gathered formally at Patricia's office for the official reading of Robert's will. David, Claire, and myself, along with Patricia and her assistant. David arrived late, visibly subdued from the humiliation of the funeral, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful, guarded silence. Patricia began methodically, reading through each provision clearly and professionally. The family home, as Robert had explained to me years earlier, came to me fully and unconditionally. The hardware business, valued at just over $2 million, was placed into a structured trust, managed initially by an independent financial firm, with clear provisions requiring unanimous agreement among all 3 beneficiaries, David, Claire, and myself, before any major decisions, including leadership changes or asset liquidation, could occur. Savings and additional assets were divided between David and Claire, structured as gradual distributions over 5 years rather than immediate lump sums, specifically designed, Patricia noted, to encourage thoughtful, sustainable financial planning. And the education trust for Claire's children remained untouched, protected entirely from any other claims. David sat in stunned silence throughout the reading, the reality of his father's careful, deliberate planning settling in fully for the first time. "So I don't get direct control of the business," he said finally, his voice flat. "No one gets direct, unrestricted control," Patricia clarified gently. "Your father was very deliberate about that, David. He wanted to protect the business and this family from any single person making unilateral decisions that could harm it." David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. After the formal reading concluded, David asked to speak with me privately. We stepped into Patricia's small side office, the tension between us heavy and unfamiliar after years of careful, distant politeness. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "Before the funeral, why let me embarrass myself like that?" I considered my answer carefully before speaking. "David, your father tried, gently for years, to guide you toward better choices. He forgave debt after debt. He overlooked warning signs because he loved you and wanted to believe in you. But when he found that unsigned power of attorney document, prepared without his knowledge, he realized something important, that love sometimes requires boundaries, not just patience." David flinched slightly at the mention of the document. "I was scared," he admitted quietly, surprising me with his honesty. "Scared about the business, about money, about what would happen if Dad got sicker and things weren't prepared. I told myself I was helping." "Maybe part of you believed that," I said gently. "But you never once discussed it openly with your father. You prepared documents quietly, without his knowledge or consent. That's not preparation, David. That's control." He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know how to be the person he wanted me to be," he finally said, his voice breaking slightly. "That's not something I can answer for you," I said honestly. "But the will your father created isn't a punishment, David. It's a structure, a safety net, for the business, for this family, and honestly, for you too. If you're willing to work within it, honestly and transparently, there's still a path forward here." I won't pretend that conversation fixed everything. Healing rarely happens in a single moment, no matter how honest. But something shifted between David and me that day, a small, fragile beginning, built not on forced reconciliation, but on finally speaking plainly about years of unspoken tension. Over the following months, David engaged, somewhat reluctantly at first, with the structured trust overseeing the business. He was required to present formal proposals, justify major decisions, and collaborate directly with both Claire and me on anything significant. It frustrated him at times, I could see that clearly. But slowly, almost against his own expectations, he began to adjust to a version of responsibility his father had specifically designed to protect him from himself. Claire, meanwhile, remained steady and supportive throughout, her quiet strength serving as a gentle counterbalance to David's more turbulent adjustment. And I focused on rebuilding my own life, grieving Robert in the quiet, unhurried way I needed to, while also stepping into the responsibilities he had trusted me with. 1 year after Robert's passing, our family gathered again, not for a funeral this time, but for a quiet dinner marking what would have been Robert's 60th birthday. It was a small gathering. David, his wife and young daughter, Claire and her children, and myself, sitting together around the same dining table where Robert and I had shared countless ordinary, beautiful evenings together. The conversation was still occasionally tense, still finding its way toward something more comfortable. But it was honest, in a way our family had rarely been honest before. David spoke, for the first time, openly about the pressures he'd felt running his own struggling consultancy, the shame he'd carried about repeatedly needing his father's financial help, and how that shame had slowly curdled into a desperate need for control disguised as responsibility. "I think I convinced myself that securing the business was about protecting the family," he admitted quietly, looking down at his hands. "But if I'm honest, it was about protecting myself from having to admit I'd failed at building something of my own." It was the most vulnerable I had ever heard him. Claire reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "You're allowed to struggle, David. You just have to be honest about it instead of hiding it." I watched this exchange quietly, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly, not forgiveness exactly, not yet fully, but the beginning of understanding. The business itself, under the structured trust Robert had created, stabilized steadily over that first year. David's forced collaboration with Claire and me, frustrating as it initially was for him, gradually pushed him toward more thoughtful, transparent decision-making. He wasn't transformed overnight into someone unrecognizable. He still occasionally showed flashes of the same entitled frustration that had defined so much of our relationship over the years. But he showed up. He engaged honestly, even when it was uncomfortable. He apologized, more than once, in small, genuine ways that felt different from his earlier performative politeness. And slowly, very slowly, something resembling an actual relationship began forming between us, not the relationship of two people pretending to get along for Robert's sake, but something built on the harder, more honest foundation of acknowledged mistakes and genuine effort. As for me, I found unexpected peace in stepping fully into the life Robert had trusted me to protect. I stayed involved with the business, not out of any desire for control, but out of a quiet commitment to honoring what he had built. I kept our home exactly as it had always been: warm, lived in, filled with 15 years of shared memories neither David's anger nor anyone else's assumptions could ever erase. I think often about that moment at the funeral, David's voice at the microphone, confidently claiming a future that was never truly his to claim. And my own voice, steady despite my grief, refusing to let a false story replace the true one. For years, I believed that keeping peace meant staying quiet, absorbing coldness, accepting dismissiveness, letting other people's assumptions about who I was and what I deserved go unchallenged, simply to avoid conflict within a grieving family. But Robert taught me something important in his final years, something I carry with me still. Peace built on silence isn't really peace at all. It's simply postponed conflict, quietly waiting for its moment to surface. Real peace, lasting peace, requires honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Even when it disrupts a carefully maintained illusion someone else has built for themselves. David spent years assuming control was the same thing as responsibility. He learned, slowly and painfully, that real responsibility requires humility, transparency, and the willingness to be held accountable, not secrecy, and not quiet manipulation disguised as protection. And I learned that protecting someone's true wishes, even after they're gone, sometimes requires standing firmly in a moment you'd rather avoid entirely. That's the lesson I want to leave you with today. If you're someone who has spent years staying quiet to keep the peace, absorbing dismissiveness to avoid conflict, letting others define your place within a family or a story that is genuinely, rightfully yours too, I hope this story reminds you of something important. The truth doesn't need you to shrink to make room for someone else's comfortable version of events. Sometimes, honoring the people we love, honoring their true wishes, their true legacy, requires exactly the kind of quiet courage it takes to finally, calmly say, "This is what actually happened. This is what they actually wanted." Not with anger, not with cruelty, just with truth. Because in the end, the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs someone brave enough to finally let it speak. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the importance of honesty, boundaries, or quiet strength within your own family, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And remember, the next time someone tries to quiet you simply to protect their own comfortable version of the truth, you don't have to shrink. You just have to be brave enough to let the truth speak for itself.